Hello, my name is Stephen Denman. My organisation is Shining Guidance. My website is shiningguidance.com. I'm going to talk to you today about how the characteristics of autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions manifest in slightly different ways to some extent between males and females that have autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions. Now, shall we say, the individuals who have autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions do tend to display the same profile of difficulties when it comes to applicating certain effective social interaction skills. They also display very unusual and repetitive and fixated forms of behaviour, including mannerisms, facial expressions, lack of eye contact, maybe repetitive fidgeting could be included in that as well. So what we need to remember is the difference is really in how these difficulties in their behavioural dysfunctions actually manifest, not the characteristics to some extent, is really what we're dealing with here. So from the perspective of, shall we say, a clinician, the work of such an individual who would be a healthcare professional really has to be given top priority because they will be at the forefront and then therefore the front line of dealing with individuals who have autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions, and therefore with their training, accreditation and certification they should be clearly able to applicate any new and up-to-date vocational and practical training that they have been given when it comes to recognizing the subtle differences in the characteristics that males and females who have autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions display. Now, we have to remember that on the whole, the female representation of autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions is pretty much no different to those of their male counterparts, and hence the first representation, say, being a non-verbal one, and the second maybe speaking in repetitive and perhaps robotic and formal and stereotypical mannerisms is again really almost indistinguishable from the kinds of behaviour that will be displayed and exhibited by any male who has autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions. So that in itself must be taken into account before we can go any further. Now, from the perspective of any healthcare professional, when it comes to dealing with individuals, whether they're male or female, with the slightly different characteristics they may be displaying, when it comes to defining autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions, we have to remember that there seems to be a severe lack of awareness on a more vocational and practical level with many healthcare professionals when it comes to dealing with the very different subtle facets of autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions. So, and this in itself then is obviously going to mean there's going to be a severe lack of knowledge concerning the more female representation aspects of autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions. And this has become a huge medical problem because it effectively means that individuals with the West, shall we say, the much less well-known profiles of autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions are far less likely to be given any effective and helpful medical diagnosis by a general practitioner or a GP, and therefore any of the medical assistance they may need or the emotional and psychological support they may desperately require just is not going to be there for them. They're going to feel very isolated, socially excluded. That will probably then start to lead to more serious mental health conditions such as major depressive disorder, MDD, also known as clinical depression. Now, I'm going to go through some of the, shall we say, more subtle characteristics which manifest as the female representation of autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions. Now, we know that, whether it's a teenage girl, therefore an adolescent, or an adult and mature woman who has autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions, one of the main differences that they actually have when it comes to comparing what their characteristics are or contrasting what their characteristics are in autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions with their male counterparts is that they tend to be far more socially motivated to go out and make an effort to try and find a close circle of male and female friends, some of whom may have autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions themselves, or perhaps the majority are neurotypical individuals. but they tend to be more socially motivated, but they just simply get it wrong. They become socially dysfunctional and awkward when they put themselves into that social environment, whether that's in a nightclub, a wine bar, it could be in a community centre, it could be at a social event that's been organised by the local city council, borough council, district council, or unitary authority. It could be, a dinner party that's been organised by some neurotypical friends of theirs at their own household. But whatever the social situation is, they feel motivated to go along, to attend, to be sociable, to socially interact with their friends, and it may even include certain work colleagues, by the same employer that they have gained employment with. But the thing is they become socially awkward. So their intentions are correct, their motivations are there to become sociable, but they simply get it wrong. Another aspect here there that could be classed as a difference is they tend to have interests that are related to social behaviours, such as wanting to go to a music concert, such as wanting to get involved with an animal welfare charity where there's a large number of other, so we say, carers there looking after the well-being of, birds and mammals, for example. And so they're in a social setting there. They're in a voluntary workplace setting in that sense. And they may want to be involved in social groups that may involve even aspects of hypnotherapy, psychotherapy, and counselling, where they're looking to use self-development and self-awareness in a social setting with other men and women, again, some of whom who may themselves have autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions, or they perhaps on many occasions are going to be neurotypical individuals. We know that another unique characteristic that is, shall we say, part of the female representation of autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions, is that they tend to internalize in the form of anxiety or clinical depression their problems to a larger extent than their male counterparts, than externalizing them through, shall we say, volatile and a behaviour that could be seen as antisocial, like some kind of physiological outburst. And therefore, because that happens, healthcare professionals are therefore going to completely underestimate and perhaps misread and misunderstand the female presentation and therefore the female overall representation of autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions. And this is going to make it more difficult for them to reach out and get actual assistance to do with their own condition. We know that, for example, females that have autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions, tend to want to mask, conceal, or therefore hide their autism spectrum disorder, ASD traits in an attempt to consistently socially fit in and socially conform with those around them that they desperately want to be friends with, and whether that's individuals who have autism spectrum disorder, ASD like themselves, or, shall we say, in a more commonplace manner, it would be individuals that are neurotypical. So we know it's very difficult for them, but we know that these are specific types of differences that they display. Individuals in a group environment generally do not appear to have autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions if they are female to a large extent. Their presentation tends to be far more removed from the textbook description of what autism spectrum disorder, ASD, effectively is, but the impact on those females is just as significant as it is to their male counterparts. For individuals generally with autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions, it is very exhausting and energetically very draining to consistently put on this, shall we say, social act of trying to look as normal and neurotypical as possible. It's incredibly tiring mentally for them and does lead to further forms of perhaps major depressive disorder, MDD, or clinical depression. So males with autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions, tend to show more of an imbalance in their excitation and inhibition levels in specific, shall we say, neural areas when it comes to social interaction. And this is obviously quite different than it is to their female counterparts. So again, there's a difference there from, shall we say, the more male and therefore masculine side when it comes to autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions. So this excitation and inhibition imbalance level may therefore affect specific brain areas when it comes to more mature types of socialization and communication, in regards to any male who has autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions, but the female who, shall we say, who has autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions, won't tend to encounter that problem because her neural structuring in her brain will be slightly different. So she finds it easier to be motivated to socially interact, but then becomes awkward when doing so, as I've mentioned previously. So these differences are very, very interesting. And they are very specific, but they're very subtle at the same time. So I think I've given enough information in this talk. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed presenting this information to you. There'll be many more videos to come in the near future. And on that note, folks, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching and goodbye.